Okay, it looks like we have quite a few folks who have joined the webinar. So thank you everybody for joining Cyera today for this webinar with Forrester Principal Analyst Heidi Shey. We're going to be talking about the changing face of data security in the cloud era. And before we kick off, I wanted to just introduce Heidi. Heidi is a Principal Analyst at Forrester, where her research primarily focuses on data security and privacy strategy, policy, and related technology controls. She's guided her clients in applying a zero-trust, data-centric approach to securing data and advises folks in the areas of sensitive data discovery and classification, data loss prevention, secure communications, and more that encompasses security and specifically data security, which we're going to talk about today. So without any further ado, Heidi, thank you so much for joining us today.
Thanks so much for inviting me to join you today. Looking forward to the conversation.
Likewise. Well, without any further ado, why don't we kick off? I'm going to go ahead and advance the slides, and here we go.
All right. I mean, fundamentally, I think when you and I were first talking about this session, it was all around these questions of just, where is your data? Is it sensitive data? What kinds of challenges are enterprises and organizations today dealing with when they're trying to answer these types of questions? And that led us down a path of, I guess you could say, more questions. Specifically, like, well, what are we dealing with? The things that I see today as I'm talking to organizations is that data sprawl has really gotten out of control, is maybe one way to explain it. Another way is if we're talking about data, especially moving it into cloud environments, it's this question of, well, what do we mean when we say cloud to begin with? Because I think of the conversations that I have, and they start off with, well, I'm concerned about data protection in the cloud. What controls can I implement for my data in the cloud? And I'm thinking, okay, well, we need to back up a little bit, because what do you mean by cloud? And when we start to unravel that a bit more, we may go down the path of looking at cloud in the sense of SaaS environments, SaaS apps, or maybe we're talking about cloud in the sense of cloud data platforms that are also partly like platform as a service, or maybe it's more cloud as in public cloud, like your infrastructure as a service type environments. And these are all under that label of cloud, but depending on what people are trying to focus on specifically, where their data is that they are concerned about, that gets us to a point where we may be looking at different controls, or those controls may be coming from different places as well. And that also influences the kinds of tools that they're looking at to ensure that those tools actually cover the environments that they are concerned about.
Absolutely. I think one of the things that on our side of the equation, we hear quite a bit from prospects and customers is everything that you just covered is certainly true, but then how often do I have to understand how the situation has changed? And so once upon a time, for example, when people used to follow waterfall development methodologies, and maybe there was a slower rate of change for applications or the ways that you engage customers, you could go in and maybe do a quarterly or a semi-annual review of what does your data landscape look like. Today, with the cloud, we're finding that people have to change the rate at which they refresh their understanding, because all it takes is a single pull request, for example, in a developer environment, or an update to one of the plugins that's used on a website. And suddenly you may have a new data store, or you may be collecting and managing new data and sensitive data that could fall under the purview of a regulation or one of your governance or security policies that as an organization, you're looking to exert some control over.
Exactly. That pace is growing and at a staggering pace as well. And there's so many, I think you get to the point about the unknowns that we just don't know about within the environment. And people are challenged as to how do they even figure out what that is, what that looks like, how to find the unknown unknowns.
Yeah, I think that's a great point. And it actually brings up a question that we wanted to ask the audience. And so we'll launch our first of 3 polls today. But the very first one is, as it pertains to your cloud adoption strategy, where are you currently in your business's cloud adoption approach? And so there's a series of options that should have been just presented in front of you. This will help Heidi and I calibrate the conversation. So we'll just give this a minute or two for you to fill it in. And Heidi, not surprisingly, as we see the answers come in, we're actually seeing a split between people who are actively migrating their infrastructure, apps, and data to the cloud. we have actually 33% of the audience who are cloud native, and then folks who are moving to a cloud first approach, or one of the more standard answers that we hear, business units are going to use the cloud when it's appropriate, given their applications or what they're looking to do with their customers. So this is some great insight for us as we continue the conversation, but it looks like about a third are actively migrating, a third are cloud native, and then the other percentages are somewhere in the middle. So thank you all very much for weighing in there. Heidi, I'm going to shift us to the next slide about cloud.
Yes. All right. So public cloud is one of the things that people tend to have a lot of concerns about. And this was the latest survey data that we had from our Forrester's Infrastructure Cloud Survey in 2022, where we asked folks, well, what are your primary concerns, if you have any, with public cloud? Not surprising, we see security, privacy concerns float to the top, especially when we're looking around things like data protection, disaster recovery. So to me, it's pointing at a little bit on the regulatory side, but if we're looking at disaster recovery and data protection within that context, it's more about availability. But then we also see concerns about application protection. So what are you building into these environments? As well as concerns about meeting specific compliance requirements. And it's interesting to see these results sort of shake out the way they do. Because if I think public cloud and how organizations have adopted the use of it today, anecdotally, you hear about less concerns about security and privacy getting in the way as a barrier. I feel like maybe a couple of years ago, that was a much bigger point of discussion. Today, less so, especially as these public cloud providers have really built in a lot of more of their own built-in capabilities to address and tackle these types of concerns. So to see meeting specific compliance requirements pop up here on the list makes me think that this is a bit of a combination between understanding what it is that the public cloud provider is doing to help you meet compliance versus what you as the organization needs to do on your end in order to ensure that you're compliant as well. So that division of responsibility and what that line looks like, I think, can be challenging sometimes.
I think, yeah, that's a great point. One of the things that we've heard from organizations who are planning their cloud journey and who maybe aren't necessarily too far ahead yet with migrating applications or re-architecting things for the cloud is there's a general idea that we can't take existing processes, we can't use existing technology in the same way as we migrate to the cloud. But given the well-architected framework, given the way that cloud providers are providing cloud native services, to your point, to do anything from discovering what data stores that you might be maintaining in their environment to what type of data that they would help you classify in that environment before you apply the relevant controls, that it shouldn't be that challenging of an enterprise to start taking what you have on-prem and applying it to the cloud. But then when we speak to folks, when they're 12 to 18 months into that journey and they start recognizing the skill requirements for individuals to understand how to use all of those technologies, and then the full-time employee effort, both the number of people and the time that are required to start understanding those cloud technologies. And while maybe you're getting things for free from some cloud native technology providers, there's still that headcount cost and that time that it takes to learn, implement, and maintain these systems, that it is really something where a wholesale sort of shift in approach, or at least evolution of that approach, is warranted.
And free, right? It's a pretty loaded descriptor here, because is it really? It's included in the price. And in other cases, they're charging you extra sometimes for added functionality related to security. I feel like as much as these public cloud providers have done with building in more controls, more capabilities around security, I think one of the things that I've noticed is that it's typically security controls in the sense of, here are more ways for you to secure this infrastructure, right? Or here are some things for you to better manage access and authorizations to that data, but it's not necessarily, in some cases, what I would label more as data-centric controls. So really controls that are about the data. I guess they may offer capabilities for encryption, access control. Some of them are doing some neat things in those spots. But for the most part, I find that companies are still turning to other sources of controls, technologies to help protect the data within these environments.
Absolutely. Well, and to your point earlier about how do you define where your data is, how do you define cloud? there's this idea as well of cloud native technologies will provide you with some excellent tools in their environment. And there are some providers like Microsoft Azure, for example, who have said, if you want to use data loss prevention technology, or if you want to use governance technology, then Purview will go outside the bounds of what you might be managing in Azure. But if you really think about the different infrastructure clouds, the different platform clouds, and then all of the other software as a service that your business might be using, it can be very challenging to think about how would you implement a control from any of those providers where you could be consistent in the way that you define your data, in the ways that you would define your policies, both defining them from a business perspective and then also implement that definition using the technology that the provider makes available. And then who on your team would actually have the expertise and the relationships to both maintain the controls, but then to work with different business units and different data owners to make sure that you remain compliant with those same policies.
And that ends up being more than a technology discussion. Like technology can certainly help, but there's loads of other things that need to be done around organizational responsibilities, governance underneath the covers there. And you're right, it's a complicated environment too. Like even if organizations are going, let's say, all in on one of these public cloud platforms, they're likely also using other ones. And it's not like you have a company that's only using one kind of SaaS app. It's going to be dozens upon dozens. So it gets to be a pretty complicated environment that we're dealing with here. And then trying to
absolutely
across all of these can be a nightmare.
Yeah. Well, and that I think brings us to the topic of your next slide.
Oh, yes. So calling it modern data security, but there's different elements that go into here. So there's this idea that you've got these new data environments to consider. That's only one part of the equation. I'm thinking of if we're looking at data in the modern world, there's a focus where your data risks are also shifting as well. Historically, like, yes, we've looked at concerns around availability. There's been a lot of focus on confidentiality for protecting the data. But on the horizon, I think we'll get to look at some more concerns and hopefully different kinds of controls to help organizations when it comes to data integrity risk. So looking at how do you determine if data is being manipulated with or tampered with, and what can you do in response? As well as expanding our view of what is actually sensitive data, what's the stuff of value that you are trying to protect. We focus a lot on compliance, on data that falls under regulatory compliance, but there's a whole other world out there if we're dealing with sensitive corporate information, things that could fall under this umbrella of intellectual property, right? And it's maybe not things that we necessarily assume, like the common things. I feel like it's typically a broader exercise for an organization to really hone in on what is it that they're trying to protect, what is revenue generating for them, what is mission critical. So then you can get down to looking at things that are, let's say, algorithms or code as things that you need to protect as well. So that's what that expanded view is trying to encompass here. And part of the challenge—
I think that makes a ton of sense. Go ahead, sorry.
And just leading on to the controls piece of it, part of the challenge now is that we've got so many different places where we can try to source control capabilities from, whether it's built into these platforms that we're using or some other third-party technology we're bringing in. And it's not just tech, it's, we're looking at governance, policies, maybe even legal means as a form of protection if we're thinking of things like algorithms.
I completely agree. And something else that we've been hearing from folks is, well, when we look at our data and we think about the controls that we need to put in place, we've got initiatives underway where we're looking at cloud native application protection. So CNAPP solutions, CWPP, CSPM technologies are one way that people are trying to exert some control over their clouds. But if you think about that sort of frame of reference, now you're dealing with cloud infrastructure. And so it's good that you will have some controls around your cloud infrastructure, but then what about the platforms? If you're using a GitHub, for example, or a GitLab, or the software as a service that you might be using either for your e-commerce initiatives or maybe for your customer engagement platforms or customer relationship management platforms, or even just the simple collaboration environment that you've had to set up, which really is anything but simple nowadays. But in our post-pandemic or maybe late pandemic world that we're currently in today, you've got folks working from home, you've got employees who you've never actually physically met before. We're heavily reliant on contractors and consultants, which maybe was always the case, but now, it's one more set of people who have access to these collaboration technologies, to these cloud technologies. And so when you start thinking about what is my data, my sensitive data landscape, and how far does it extend, you really got to start thinking about, well, what are some of the workflows that I manage and maintain as a business? And we can learn some things from some of the recent fines that have occurred, whether it be Sephora doing something that arguably on the face of it is very standard from a marketing perspective, which is adding all of these plugins to enrich the customer experience. But that also comes with a data sharing burden that they have to manage as it pertains to privacy and compliance with privacy statutes, or something like just trying to protect all of your remote employees from phishing exploits or other vulnerabilities that a zero trust sort of a framework would help you with. And I think that's an interesting thing for me when I think about the last 8+ years of the security landscape, all really heavily discussing what is zero trust? How do I adopt a zero trust architecture? But then as it pertains to data, really thinking about how we are effectively building moats and castles around data as we address infrastructure and platforms, software and applications, users and access. All of these things are really encircling or encompassing our data. And maybe to the point of your slide, it's time to think about applying security to the data itself directly.
Bringing those controls closer to the data itself. And with everything that you've mentioned about these different environments of data is in, we're seeing this as well, where all of these kinds of environments are building in their own capabilities. And a lot of the conversations I have with my clients is about, well, when do you use those built-in capabilities versus when do you need something else beyond that? And what are the trade-offs of each approach that you take? Because it's all about trade-offs at the end of the day, for a number of different considerations, whether it's the depth of the control that you're dealing with, maybe it's cost concerns, that's another major factor, performance, depending on the type of control, because sometimes if you're dealing with encryption, if it's built into the environment, chances are you get better performance, especially in a SaaS app. So a lot of variables and factors to consider there. And zero trust, when we bring that into the discussion, this is where I find that a lot of people get tripped up because they somehow assume that this is a completely separate approach or different way of doing things, when in reality, it's not too different from how we have thought about data security for the longest time. At the most basic level, you're trying to figure out what it is that you have, that you want to protect, and apply some type of control to it to enforce a policy of some type for data that's being used, when it's at rest, for data that's being shared, controls that control the life cycle of that data. So that hasn't changed. In a zero trust world, or taking a zero trust approach, it's really now, I think, to the benefit of data security, where you're looking at all these other places where these control points could be for you to apply for data security, as well as the telemetry you may be getting from these other places, this other context or insight that helps you to determine some more adaptive or risk-based controls that you then apply to the data based on how you figure out where someone may be trying to make a request from, where they're working from, the security posture of their device. So it's a lot richer of an environment to make a data control decision to grant access or not.
Yeah, I completely agree. And two of the things I think that we're seeing, to your point about trade-offs, when you think about just the scope and the burden of really architecting something robust here, it's having access to enough people with enough critical skills, or being able to train them and maintain those skills so that they can apply them to this idea of data security across its life cycle. So anywhere from secure development to how we think about access to the applications that we're building, whether that's role-based access, or if you've got automation that's accessing your data, and then basically what happens throughout its life cycle, who's accessing it, who's processing it, and where all of those different intermediary steps occur, and any exhaust or any output that might be generated as a result of it. All of that has to come into play. And so that actually prompts me for our second poll question. As it pertains to data security priorities, what are the priorities for your organization? Is it security, regulatory compliance, thinking about resilience from ransomware, enabling the business, or at this point, is it just not something that your business is investing in? We'll give people just a moment to answer here. We've got some answers coming in. It looks like security is the overwhelming priority so far.
Ooh, that is encouraging, right? Because it's different from compliance. And usually compliance is the thing that opens up the wallets for folks.
Absolutely. All right, it looks like we've got some folks who are being driven by compliance, and then others who are being purely driven by security requirements. So that's great. Thank you, everybody, for sharing that. So Heidi, now that we've talked about the fact that this requires an expanded scope and approach, what are some of the stakes that businesses are facing for data security?
Well, it's an expanded approach, but the core, like we mentioned, remains pretty similar. Like you really still need to understand what it is you're trying to protect. So this whole concept of knowing your data is still critical. I think conceptually in the past, people would think like, yeah, this is important, but it wasn't something that they really, really dedicated too much focus to because it was hard, but it's only getting harder. And that topic of discovery, classification remains one of the top areas of client inquiry that I get today. I'd say easily like half of the discussions I have are on this topic of people trying to understand, well, how can I do this? What tools can help me with this? What are some best practices? And just how to get started, because it seems like this daunting thing, right? And the stakes for it it's rising today because people, organizations, they want to really maximize what it is that they're doing with data, because that's when it has value, when you actually use it, not when you keep it locked away, super secure somewhere where no one can touch it. But in that use, we have to try to figure out how do we mitigate the data risk and what are those risks and identify them to begin with. And so these stakes that we talk about, we try to make an alliteration here, compliance, costs, complexity, these are the things that keep people up at night if they don't have a good handle on knowing and understanding their data. So compliance, I think there are the usual suspects. If we think about things like privacy regulations, privacy compliance, that typically is top of mind for folks. And this could also be things that are like industry specific compliance requirements as well. If we're thinking about, PCI for PCI data or HIPAA, healthcare information. But we're also looking at country specific obligations, local regulations as well, contractual ones that you may have with business partners, where you say, well, we're going to handle data and apply controls. You have to make sure you meet those promises that you're making. And one of the other interesting things we've been following is there was finally finalized last week, but the FTC settlement against Drizzly. For the longest time, we've seen that a lot of these fines and penalties were applied to the company, to the organization itself. And this is a bit of an interesting one because now it's also consequences for an executive, for the CEO of this organization, where this order from the FTC is going to follow them to their next job, to the next organization that mandates what they have to do when they get there. So that was an interesting one to watch. And I think more regulators may be paying attention to something like this because people take note when it's not just a monetary fine for a company. Now you're getting personal.
Well, and I think that's another interesting point as well. When we think about some of the conversations that we've had as we engage customers. So one of the first steps that we typically take is to run a data risk assessment for someone, just to show them, here's how much data you're managing. Within that, how much of it's sensitive. It's distributed across this many data stores. And here's some of the compliance, regulatory or security frameworks where when you think about the exposure that sensitive data might have, you are currently running afoul of or you risk running afoul of. And so, the first step is really to try to help people quantify what is the scope of the problem that I'm dealing with. And then to the point that you made, I think around complexity, the interesting thing here is akin to that assertion that cloud native protection is free. When we think about the complexity of actually dealing with some of these issues, you have to think about the way that they're evolving. So right now, if you get a request for a subject access request or a record of processing activity request from a privacy perspective or a spot audit by one of the regulators, you have a certain amount of time when you've got to be able to highlight, I know where my data is, I know exactly what I'm managing, and here are the controls that I have in place to secure it. If you think about the ways that some of these regulations may evolve, the FCC just recently proposed something where they would bring down the notification time frame dramatically from what it is today, basically forcing any of these telecom providers to instantly notify the regulators, but also their constituents or their customers when a breach had occurred. Now, that's a really challenging thing to think about complying with, first and foremost, because when do you actually detect that something happens? Soak time for malware or ransomware or an attacker can be anywhere from 45 days to over 200 days, depending on what data you're consuming before it's actually detected. And then the scope that exposure could have led to, the blast radius, so to speak, of the security exposure that you have, sometimes can take businesses weeks or over a month to really quantify, because you start surveying business users, understand what data they're managing, what customer information they've been taking in, what applications that's coming in the form of, what analysts or other data scientists within the organization may have had access to, and on you go, so that the scope of the problem continues to expand. Mm-hmm. And, as the cloud adoption grows, as people start thinking about leveraging additional technologies and helping the business to grow by sharing that data and sharing the insights, it really is a problem that just keeps getting bigger.
It is, and especially in the scenario of maybe there's a possible breach or some type of exposure. If you can nail down who was affected, what data was affected early on in the process, and hopefully rule out the notification obligation, that could be huge and save you a lot of time. But otherwise, you really need to get a handle on how do you even figure that out so that you can meet the regulatory obligations for notification within the time frame that you need to. So either way, there's a need to be able to do it at scale and quickly. And there was a point that you also mentioned earlier about surfacing all these data risks initially as well, that I think is important to reiterate here, because if you don't know what those risks are, you can't really figure out how you're going to prioritize addressing and mitigating them. In years past, you might have had executives who were like, I don't want to hear about what's wrong because now I'm obligated to go and take action. And I think that mentality, that mindset is fading, thankfully. You have people who, yes, they want to know. They want that visibility. They want to understand what those risks are so they can develop that plan to mitigate them, even if they haven't gone down that path of actually implementing the control or getting too far along. At least they are aware, because not being aware is not really an excuse today. And so long as you are at least demonstrating you are aware, you've got plans in place, you are taking steps towards applying reasonable controls and measures towards protecting your data, that's still something that regulators will look for.
Totally. And so, to that end, let's talk about what some of the companies that Forrester surveys priorities are.
Oh, yeah. So we're looking at tactical information and IT security priorities within this question that we asked in our global security survey last year for security tech decision makers. And so this was broken out across different industries where people who responded and told us, we are prioritizing improving data security capabilities like identification and classification. And it's interesting to see. So some of these are combined, like bucketed together. Like you see public sector, healthcare combined at the top as one overarching industry, along with things like retail, wholesale, business services, and construction. This is just our standard display for industries, and also partly for sample. Like you want a good sample to be able to at least look at the data through like that particular lens. And I suspect that a lot of what we see here in that public sector healthcare bucket is driven by public sector. Especially if we look at, let's say, public sector in the US federal, there's been a lot of push towards zero trust initiatives, writing like data security guides. So I would imagine that this is also kickstarting a lot of these efforts to really do better with identification and classification of data.
Yeah, we've seen a series of executive orders as well that are really pushing government organizations and not-for-profits to improve their data security, but also improve their approach to zero trust in general, to have the right level of controls and then also the right processes and systems in place to keep things up to date so that they can manage this evolving landscape of data that really any business is managing. And it's interesting because you and I had a discussion about this breakout before the webinar, and we had heard, or I specifically have heard from some prospects, really interesting feedback on how they gauge their priorities. And specifically, a CISO in a healthcare organization recently told me, well, this has been a problem for my organization for over 20 years. We've been under regulatory constraints. We have a burden of proof that we have to bring to any sort of a breach or accidental disclosure or misuse sort of a finding or investigation. And so what's really different here? And the answer of what's really different here, I think, is first and foremost awareness and education. Your customers or patients, as well as the industry as a whole, are more aware of this burden and also what it takes to comply. Now, individuals want to have their cake and eat it too, in the sense that they want to have these personalized experiences that minimize the number of clicks and provide them with the right information as easily and quickly as possible. And yet they want to preserve as much of their own personally identifiable information as possible. They want to protect themselves from breaches. But I think as the general public is concerned, they're unaware of how to balance those two things. And the average user, when they're presented with cookie notifications or options to opt in or out of communications, typically pick whatever will get them to their objective online faster versus taking a step back and actually reading what they're complying with or agreeing to. And I think, as it pertains to businesses or business units inside of an organization, there's really a difference in how much a, let's say, development or product organization understands about the burden for security and privacy from their perspective versus what the marketing team understands, where typically it'll fall to privacy statutes, where, in marketing, you always think about GDPR or CCPA, not necessarily the broader ecosystem of data security policies or privacy concerns. And the security team is left with sort of this insurmountable challenge of both being the educator and the guide, as well as the enforcer that can't really afford to disrupt the business. And so it's really a precarious position that I think most security teams find themselves in to help manage this process.
Mm-hmm. Exactly. And it's hard to navigate. I'm also seeing organizations that have, the security team is struggling to keep up here, because you do have other business units who are trying to do more with data. Like personalization is a great example. Another one that I've run across is you've got chief data officers, your data science teams trying to do more around analytics, maybe to make predictions, not necessarily related to marketing, but other things that could help to drive, let's say, product or service development. And in some cases, I'm seeing that these are additional stakeholders that are pushing these types of initiatives around classification that previously they weren't really part of the discussion before, but now they are leading the charge, which is really exciting to see.
You totally agree. So that's actually bringing up our last poll and a question that we wanted to pose to the audience, which is, which groups inside of your organization purchase discovery and classification tools? Which is an interesting question when you think about what it actually means to comply with privacy regulations or who may audit your business or your organization, forcing them to maintain some form of data store inventory or sensitive data inventory. So far, we've got the security team and GRC, or Global Risk and Compliance, as the two groups. And we'll just take another moment and let people fill in their answers here. So it's looking like the security team is just edging out GRC here for this audience. Give it another moment. Great. All right, and we'll show you the results, but it looks like the security team and GRC are the two main groups that folks here see as procuring this technology, which is interesting because in my experience, certainly since starting with Cyera, we've seen quite a lot with privacy and IT teams as well, who might maintain discovery and classification for an IT managed inventory for, let's say, collaboration tools, whether it's Office 365 or Microsoft 365 or Google Drive, or privacy teams who are really thinking about complying with a lot of these audits that come through. But I guess the core question is, why is this so hard?
A number of reasons. And I think the kinds of results that we see in terms of who might be driving this internally, the different groups involved is telling as well. Because you do have many groups, many different stakeholders that are involved in this. And part of the challenge is that they might also have different definitions of what data discovery is or what classification entails, depending on their role and how they view this. So if I try to break it down, it's almost like I'll see organizations that have, like, yes, your security, your IT team, maybe thinking about discovery and classification in the sense of help me find and identify what is sensitive so we can protect it. Whereas you might have privacy, legal, who may be looking at this through the lens of similar, like what's sensitive, but particularly personal information that's going to fall under the scope of these privacy regulations. Whereas you talk to someone who's in more of a data management type of role, and this could be very, very different, where data discovery is more about discovering data sources. Classification could be about what I would say is categorization of data. Like in an information governance sense, maybe this is about identifying what's an invoice versus what's a memo versus some other content or type of data, where you're dealing with this for purposes around like knowledge management as an organization. So you can look at it through many different lenses. And that's the beginning of the struggle, because everyone is sort of running with their own siloed efforts on this front. The tools that they're using may be completely different. So this leads to the point about a very noisy, often siloed tech landscape, because you have different tools who say they can do discovery and classification, but it's for very different outcomes, very different types of use cases. So the functionality is a bit different, and you can't really compare them apples to apples. And this middle challenge about these misconceptions and this disconnect between concept and practice, this goes back to what I alluded to a little bit earlier about this being this thing in people's heads that has to be this massive endeavor where they're like, oh my gosh, this is overwhelming. We have so much data. It's in so many places. Where do we begin? How do we break this down? And so there's this notion that you have to find everything before you can act on it or do something about it. And I think that's where people get tripped up, because this is hard. You're probably not going to get to that comfortable spot that you're hoping for, because these data volumes are just going to keep growing within your organization. Like every single day, it's just more and more data being generated, being created. So it's a parallel approach in terms of what you're doing for discovery and classification and the controls that you're applying. I see this with like DLP initiatives within an organization, but you could apply it to other things as well, where you're trying to discover and classify data for X purpose or X outcome. You're really running these in parallel, trying to break it down into manageable chunks so that you can move forward. It's almost like looking at this in terms of two different initiatives. One is you're trying to do this for the data that already exists. Call it your legacy data, the data that's sitting there that you know you have, as well as another effort for data that's being generated today. And where I'm going with this is that you can probably imagine trying to do this manually just doesn't work. Not anymore, not today. That's where automation is really critical for a lot of this. There's still room for maybe some manual touch points, human intervention, but for the most part, you're going to need some form of automation to keep up.
Absolutely. And thinking about progress versus perfection, to your point about, you're not going to discover 100% of everything in a durable fashion, because things are constantly changing and increasingly changing in real time. So how do you really think about leveraging that automation and something that can take the burden of discovery off of full-time employees or individuals' shoulders and put it on a technology instead? To say, I need you to dynamically and continuously discover for me, versus using a very loose definition of discovery where the human is helping the technology discover by pointing it at the known knowns. In this case, all of the unknowns are the things that have the highest potential to really lead to one of these compliance violations or a fine or some other form of breach that so many companies are dealing with today. And in some cases, companies are dealing with it multiple times over, because it's such a challenging problem to address. And I think the other real concern, to your point about classification versus categorization, is an understanding of the so what. So what would I do with understanding that not only am I managing healthcare data when I fall under a HIPAA requirement, but understanding that it's a person's, for example, name versus their medical record number versus their treatment information. Wouldn't I treat it all the same way? And the answer is no, because depending on what your application does and who might be using that information inside of your organization, the controls and certainly the access controls that you would apply should be different, where you have to think about what is the business purpose for managing and accessing this data, especially as you get into the nuances of a category of healthcare data or personal data or financial data. And then beyond that, what environments could that information exist in? Should I be tokenizing it or putting sample data in place of the real data so that my developers can still do their job developing the next generation of the application that a customer or a patient might interact with, but they're still seeing something that looks real enough for them to develop it correctly? Or do I need to give all of this personally identifiable information or private healthcare information or transactional data to a data analyst for them to be able to help the business evolve and think about the next generation of its strategy? And more often than not, the answer is very, very highly nuanced. And it starts with this baseline of, do I know where my data is? Do I know what it represents? And do I understand the exposure that it represents, not only to me as a business, or certainly within the business to a security organization, but to our ability to do business and evolve with the way that we engage our customers or our patients going forward? And that, I think, is something that, yes, it's a technology problem, but it's really a people and a process problem as well. But maybe just to keep things grounded, Heidi, and as we're coming up here close to the top of the webinar timeframe allotted, what is the technological problem here?
A couple of different points. I like to use this analogy of utensils. You're thinking about the right tools for the job, right? And with utensils, you get a pretty wide range of quality, of what's available and where you get it from. Because if you think about, let's say, the utensils that may come from a takeaway order, those can also vary greatly. You can get the really flimsy ones that you can barely eat with. In other cases, it's suitable, but do you really want to use that one? That's a whole other question. And so think about the technology as utensils. It's going to vary, and you're going to have to make decisions about what's available to you, what's the right tool for the job that you're trying to accomplish, like what are you trying to eat with this utensil, versus is there an alternative that could be better suited for what you're trying to do? And so the bullets that we have here on the screen are some of the common challenges, at least, that I run across, where the technology is a challenge because of the scope of data environments that it actually covers. You might have one technology that's really good at particular data environments, but it omits these other ones because it just doesn't function there or doesn't hook into those environments. This is also part of the challenge where we see today data discovery classification is often built in as a functionality within so many things. It's a feature now in a lot of places, but as a feature, the scope of what it covers is not universal. It's not the same. The quality of how it does the discovery and classification can also vary widely as well. So this goes back to that trade-off consideration of, if you're going to use what's built in versus something that's purpose-built for this, what can you expect from each of these approaches? And how the technology tackles classification is another area of difference as well, because you've got some that may still be relying on things like pattern matching, regular expressions. These are all foundational things for classification, but then you have other tools that now pull in more to do with AI or machine learning, or have things like trainable classifiers for you to really tailor this technology for the specific types of data within your environment, things that may be unique to your environment that you want to train these models on to look for and classify. And also the use cases that are supported can be very different as well. Across security, across privacy, across data management, you'll get technologies that may be very good at one of these or two of these, but trying to go across all three to meet the needs of every single stakeholder who needs this technology capability it's hard. So sometimes you're forced to look and make some choices as to which direction you'll go in, specifically based on what outcomes you're trying to achieve.
Yeah, and I would say beware the spork. So,
Spork.
people love to make fun of sporks as the spoon fork combination. But if we think about when you try to procure a technology, and to Heidi's point, the stakeholders, the purpose behind the technology in the first place, and then who's actually going to be the group that's going to use it? Are they the ones that have the appropriate skills and knowledge and time to actually leverage the tool appropriately? Those are all questions that you need to ask. And I mentioned spork, one, because it's silly, but if you really think about it, it's not great at being a spoon or a fork, but it is something that tried to merge a bunch of things into one form factor. When we talk to businesses and ask them, what are some of the material challenges that you have with discovery and classification, we hear things like, well, it was great for a snapshot in time, but it's really hard for us to maintain over the life cycle of our data. And the life cycle of data is interesting, right? Because depending on the application, depending on the industry, that could be an ephemeral life cycle. It could be something that you create, like a microsite, for example, for a business where it's created, it serves its purpose, and then very quickly it's eliminated. Or it could be, like the flight traffic controlling software that's been all over the news recently, which is a 50-plus-year-old technology that continues to live on while the major business stakeholders figure out how to evolve it. But the challenges will become how much time you can really spend and who is equipped to spend the time in a way that is fit for purpose to maintain this technology, to evolve it as the data requirements and the compliance requirements, and then also just the overall business requirements change and evolve. And then from there, to the point of your last bullet, does it actually support my use cases? One of the biggest torturous decisions that we hear people making, especially going into the current financial climate that we have in 2023, is I've spent so much time on this technology that I've procured, so much of my people's time, so much budget and training them and setting up the systems. I feel like we must be close to having all of our data discovered and classified. To your point, we spent a lot of time on sample data and regular expressions and really tuning all the false positives out of the system that we're looking forward to actually using the product for what we purchased it for. And I think part of the false promise here is that you ever will get to the end of that process if the technology requires manual effort to do it. And so that, I think, is one of the biggest challenges that businesses have is I want to get to the use cases for what I've decided to invest in, but getting to that point beyond the foundation of discovery and classification, to your point, feels like, it's elusive. It's always at your fingertips, but you can never quite grasp it.
Yeah. And I don't know if I would characterize this as a thing that has an end either, because to me, it's going to be ongoing because you're just going to keep generating it. So it has to keep going. And sporks, I won't dunk on the sporks because I'm thinking like maybe this could be useful in some cases, like if you're going camping, right? You're packing less, perhaps. And I kind of think of sporks as another one where if we're talking about approaches to classification, I know the automation piece is absolutely a thing that you need today. That said, there's still room for, I think, some of the manual approaches that historically dominated, that user-driven, getting that human input is valuable in certain use cases where you do want that human to look at it and say like, oh yeah, this is a particular type of highly sensitive info. And today I'm primarily seeing that in defense and government, where that's still a really popular, prevalent thing where they're trying to combine these approaches where you pick out some that's manual and then others that are automated and some in between hybrid where you're making suggestions for folks. But it comes down to what are you trying to achieve and accomplish and backing out what are the technology approaches that can actually get that job done. What's the right utensil?
I completely agree. And you're right. There's always a use for something somehow. But Heidi, I want to thank you for all the insights that you shared here, and I want to be respectful of the audience's time. Thank you all for joining us for this webinar. If there's anything here that you thought was particularly interesting or compelling that you want to continue the conversation on, I would encourage you to check out a further Q&A that we've done with Heidi. We'll be pushing that out to our LinkedIn channel. It's currently available at cyera.io in our blog section. And if you'd like to get started with a data risk assessment, all it takes is about 5 minutes of your time, and Cyera will produce for you a data risk assessment in one of your cloud accounts or organizations of your choosing. So please don't hesitate to sign up for that. We'd love to show you how we can mix automation and artificial intelligence and machine learning together to provide you with a better way, we believe, or a next generation way of discovering and classifying your sensitive data and then applying the appropriate security controls. But for now, thanks everybody again for attending. Thank you, Heidi, for your time and preparing for and presenting this information. We really appreciate it. And I hope everybody has a great rest of your day and rest of your week.
Thank you all.